One book that I've always appreciated greatly is Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. The one I'll be reading is a new translation with an introduction by Gregory Hayes. I think it's in the Modern Library Classics. That's what it's got as a publisher. Uh, I don't think it really probably matters which translation you get too much on this. And I'm just going to start in book one, and I'll read a little bit here and there, and we'll kind of just talk about what I think about it, what you guys think about it down below. So it's called Book One, Debts and Lessons. And he starts with his family, interestingly enough, which I think is kind of a comprehensive review. He's looking over what impressions he has of them and what he thinks of them, because I don't think he knew his father very well. So he starts, my grandfather, Varus, character and self-control. My father, from my own memories and his reputation, integrity and manliness. My mother, her reverence for the divine, her generosity, her inability not only to do wrong, but even to conceive of doing it, and the simple way she lived, not in the least like the rich. And I think that's, we have to remember that Marcus Aurelius was an emperor, so he was at the top of the top, 1% of the 1% of the 1%. Something really, not even conceivable, I think, to most people today in a lot of ways. That's that sort of position that he held. Maybe a president or a CEO of a huge corporation that spans several countries could achieve that, maybe that same sort of thing. But even then, I mean, he had he kind of had absolute law and role a little bit on his side. So even in that respect, it's more like a corporation and a government combined into one. But even here we see the simple way she lived, not in the least like the rich. And that seems so odd that someone who was probably wealthier than anyone could imagine, certainly had more power than anyone could possibly imagine, any normal person, did not like the way the rich lived, and thought it not good, since he contrasts his mother as not even being able to conceive of wrongdoing. My great-grandfather, to avoid the public schools, to hire good private teachers, and to accept the resulting costs as money well spent. That advice seems just as good today as it was back then. Avoid the public schools. My first teacher, not to support this side or that in chariot racing, this fighter or that in the games, to put up with discomfort and not make demands, to do my own work, mind my own business, and have no time for slanderers. So he's talking there about, I think, entertainment that I think most of us would call entertainment for the masses. Not to get too pulled into that, because that does seem to be more of a time waster. Certainly, I think it's appreciated. You can always appreciate good athletics. However, not to support this side or that in chariot racing, this fighter or that in the games. It does seem to be a bit of a waste of passion, so to speak, to put it into that instead of something perhaps more meaningful, like your family or your work. To put up with discomfort and not make demands. Okay. Do my own work, mind my own business, and have no time for slanderers. And I do feel in this current society that we're currently going through with the politically correct speech and terms such as racist, homophobe, transphobe being very freely thrown out, that apparently the slanderers is a continuing problem. And I know that right now it seems like it's a particular problem, because I do not remember back in the 90s or even the 80s the word racist being very thrown casually out to call people something like that. But it can be dropped immediately with very little information. I mean, some people have even put forth the idea that all people are inherently, or all white people are inherently racist. So that's kind of a complete judgment already of quite a number of people, which I'm not sure that we want to get into prejudging people based on characteristics that they can't control, such as their melanin content. But I digress. Let's get back to this thing here. Dionytus, not to waste time on nonsense, not to be taken in by conjurers and hoodoo artists with their talk about incantations and exorcism and all the rest of it. Look at that. People haven't changed. How many people read a horoscope? How many people believe in, or like a lucky rabbit's foot, or any number of superstitions, or as he calls it here, they're talking of incantations, conjurers, and hoodoo artists. I'm not so sure that we've come really even that far, because a lot of things such as vegetarianism, being a vegetarian, or rather I should say a vegan. Vegetarianism isn't that, that's not that bad health-wise. But being a vegan, like a strict vegan, there's not a whole lot of actual evidence for that. That's more, hoodoo talk. It's not necessarily better for the environment. I don't think that's been conclusively shown. And I don't think, and actually evidence to the contrary, that if we all ate plants, that it would actually be very devastating to the environment due to the massive farming that would be required to get the caloric value for everyone. But I mean, we do see that people will fall for something that they want to believe in, just as in back then. Not to be obsessed with quail fighting or other crazes like that. To hear unwelcome truths. Oh, that's something that we could definitely learn, I think. To hear unwelcome truths. We don't want to believe it. May be true. Maybe your spouse is cheating on you. You don't want to believe it. It's probably better to deal with it and figure out what to do for next, right? Instead of just trying to ignore it. The talk right now in society, a lot of, free speech. Well, I don't think that there's a lot of people that actually do believe in free speech right now. And we're going to unfortunately have to talk about that, because if we don't figure out a way to talk about it, then physical violence is the next, kind of result, as we have seen increasing physical violence continue to grow as people attempt to exercise their free speech in demonstrations, and then one side will resort to violence. That is not productive to avoiding violence and figuring out a way with our brains to move forward. Moving forward by using our fists, while that is effective in a crude, barbaric sense, the resulting costs to society and everyone else seems to be pretty detrimental, because we call that war. And that's basically what they're doing. They're engaging in warfare and attempting to incite it instead of having the conversation, having the debate. That's why I have great respect for people like Ben Shapiro or Gad Saad, people that will freely go and debate other people that have extremely opposing ideas to theirs. But they have enough inside of them that they are willing to stand on their argument and have that discussion. To practice philosophy and to study with Bacchius and then with Tandus and Marcianus. To write dialogues as a student. That's very important, writing. And as I get older, I find that it's more and more important to write. Even if you just write a little bit. Even just a couple of sentences a day, or even one sentence, I think. It places your mind in a different frame when you write things. Even like doing this sort of thing, like talking, puts your mind in a different frame as well. And so I do think that dialogue, and I don't think I would count this as a dialogue. This is more almost like a self-journal type thing. But, I can receive feedback from people. So it's a dialogue of sorts. But not a true dialogue. I don't want to confuse that. But dialogue, and then also writing and looking at your writing. Like, I've written lots of things that I've just gotten rid of because I didn't think they were useful or good. Going back, writing them, going back like a week or two later, reading it and being like, that's no good. That's not going to help anything or anyone. And then again, I remember some high school papers, or not high school, but college papers that I wrote. And I've gone back, even 5 or 10 years later and reread them and been like, that wasn't too bad. That was okay. and kind of surprising because I've obviously totally forgotten it by that point. But this idea of right dialogues, I think that's we could all do with a little bit of that. To choose the Greek lifestyle, the camp bed, and the cloak. Now, honestly, I don't really know what that means precisely, but given that he says camp bed and the cloak, seems kind of a bit more Spartan. He didn't say living in a palace with all sorts of luxuries, that sort of thing. Camp bed does not sound like a, luxurious lifestyle. So I would guess it has something to relate to that. Rusticus, the recognition that I needed to train and discipline my character. Absolutely. We are not moral individuals by birth. It is something that you have to work at, and work at forever. If you do not discipline yourself, you will never get any better as a person. And it's hard. Especially, I think, given, now maybe it's just as hard back then, because the more I kind of read about the past, it seems like people really haven't changed. And the same complaints we have now are the same complaints they had. Perhaps a bit louder now that we have electronic communications, the internet, so that we can hear not just the people in our geographic location that we can actually physically reach and hear from, but people all over the world, everybody at once, 9 billion voices crying out at once, so to speak. But it is something you have to practice at. And I think there's this assumption that your moral character, you're just a moral person, like it just happens. But it doesn't. It's the result of continued decisions over your life. And each of those decisions add up to who you are, good and bad, into the mix that makes you you. So when you choose something poor, that goes into the mix just as if you make a good choice. And none of us make good choices all the time. I mean, I think that's silly to think that we're all making good choices all the time. Fortunately, in our current modern Western world, it's kind of convenient to go along with the crowd because it's a very easy life. So, we don't necessarily have to rob a whole bunch or resort to physical violence as much as we had to in the past. But that's also a result of our affluent and ease of life. Most people have access to like Netflix. You could spend your whole life watching stuff on Netflix, and good stuff too. It's not even like it's junk. You could, watch a lot of good entertainment, even perhaps valuable, educational in some ways, in documentaries. Not to be sidetracked by my interest in rhetoric. Not to be too interested in talking for talking's sake. Yep. Not to write treatises on abstract questions or deliver moralizing little sermons or compose imaginary descriptions of the simple life or the man who lives only for others. To steer clear of oratory, poetry, and belles lettres. I don't know what belles lettres is, but I think that is something that is definitely important, that we can't imagine an entire world inside our heads and kind of just try to impose that merely through our language. And I know that kind of sounds a little maybe abstracty, and I'm not really sure, like deliver moralizing little sermons or compose imaginary descriptions of the simple life. I think he's much more interested in doing and reflection, getting that feedback, and then moving forward. Instead of just, I think this, we should do it, and there's nothing else given to it. No feedback, no reflection. Because, you can imagine anything in our minds. Just because you can imagine it doesn't make it so. But I think that some people think if you can imagine it, it is real, in a sense. And I think in a metaphysical concept, you could argue that you've planted a seed if you imagine something, and if you continue to immerse yourself in that imagination, it will grow. But that doesn't mean it's real. That means it's a metaphysical concept, like an archetype. And that can be real for your mind, for your fantasy that you've created, but that doesn't make it actually real. Right? There's a personal reality, and then there's the reality outside. And admittedly, our understanding of the reality outside is extremely narrow. We have our five senses to go on, and it's an awfully crude way to see. Like, I mean, even if you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, the visible light spectrum is such a tiny portion of the whole spectrum of the information that we're receiving. It's, well, it really makes you wonder, especially for atheists in a lot of ways. Like, there's some form or function here of rhyme, necessarily. It's not all random, blips in the radar necessarily. But that given aside, that small slice of information that we have, and you know what? We divide that small slice for vision into an even smaller slice. And it would be interesting, if anyone has any papers or anything related to this, please post it down below. I'll take a look at it. Of all the information available to us, let's just take the electromagnetic spectrum, visual, Of all that electromagnetic spectrum, what percentage of that do we see in the visible spectrum, which I imagine is probably like 5% or something. And then of that, what do we actually see? Now, this, I guess, was the part that's hard to quantify. But we don't see everything all at once, right? We're kind of seeking, something. We have kind of a meaning. And even if you don't have a meaning, and you're just looking for something interesting, right? I'm bored. I want something to interest me. So you're looking for anything interesting, right? You have kind of, we can't see everything all at once. We'd be overwhelming. We couldn't ever function or move. It would be interesting just how little that we actually see. It kind of reminds me of the very famous, psychology experiment where they have a group of kids passing a ball around. You're supposed to count the ball, how many times it gets passed, and then they have a guy in an ape costume walk through the scene, do a little dance, and walk off. And usually about half the people don't even see that because they're focused so much on the ball, which I guess really isn't surprising. It's surprising that anybody, I guess, saw, but maybe some people weren't even bothering to count, and that's the reason they saw the ape. They didn't listen to directions. It would be interesting to figure out, like, what people notice that and not. What's a little bit more going on there. Not to dress up just to stroll around the house or things like that. To write straightforward letters, like the one he sent my mother from Sunessa, and to behave in a conciliatory way when people who have angered or annoyed us want to make up. Seems fairly reasonable. He doesn't even say that you do make up with the person, just that you should behave in a way that allows it to perhaps happen, which I think is an interesting distinction. It's like, when somebody comes to make up, so to speak, don't just automatically have a bad attitude. Have a good faith to see what's going on, right? To read attentively, not to be satisfied with just getting the gist of it, and not to fall for every smooth talker. Oof. In some ways, I feel all of society has fallen into being smooth talkers in a way. It's one of the reasons I even ever hesitated to make any videos, was because I kind of feel like I don't want to add to the static. I don't want to add to just the noise in the background, but something that you can take away and it will actually improve your life. Yeah, I mean, in a small way. I'm not talking, anything drastic here. Maybe you're at work, maybe you're bored right now, and, we're just going through a little bit of the Meditations with Marcus Aurelius. And I do think that this, it's quite possible in reading this that someone's going to point out something that I missed. I'm almost positive that if enough people listen to this, that they would point out some stuff that I missed and already what I read and some other meanings to it. And I do think that that's useful, as a useful exercise. Because we do get different viewpoints, and new information, we can't see all viewpoints at once. We really can't be in other people's shoes. We can only be in our own shoes unless we have a conversation. Now, I guess you can, if you have a good imagination and you're very introspective, you can take some time to warp your thinking into a different perspective. But I don't think, most of us, probably, 95 at least percent of the population isn't going to be able to do that. And some points of view are harder to get to than others. So, and for introducing me to Epictetus's lectures and loaning me his own copy. People loaned books back then. I know, they were limited. I know. I think it's just funny he included that. By the way, these meditations were supposed to be burnt on his deathbed. They were just for him. He was only writing, like, as a reminder for himself. And fortunately, one of his servants, or slaves, I don't remember which, decided that they couldn't do it. They just couldn't burn it. It was too valuable. And thank God that person, who is unknown and has been long forgotten in history, saved this book for us, because I do believe it is quite the gem of kind of common sense, written by someone who is entirely not common in any shape, form, or fashion. Apollonius. Independence and unvarying reliability. Yes, being reliable. That's probably one of the most important things to everybody, that someone is reliable. Definitely. And to pay attention to nothing, no matter how fleeting, except the logos. Interesting. And to be the same in all circumstances, in intense pain, the loss of a child, chronic illness, and to see clearly, from his example, that a man can show both strength and flexibility. His patience in teaching, and to have seen someone who clearly viewed his expertise and ability as a teacher as the humblest of virtues. And to have learned how to accept favors from friends without losing your self-respect or appearing ungrateful. That is actually kind of hard to do. How you can accept favors and not feel less of yourself for having someone help you, but also being genuinely grateful for it. Again, he says character takes training and discipline. Showing that you're grateful in a genuine manner for a favor someone has done you actually does take practice. Sextus. Kindness. An example of fatherly authority in the home. What it means to live as nature requires. That's very interesting. He puts that, an example of fatherly authority in the home. Because I know right now with the SJWs and the feminists that there's a large talk of getting rid of masculinity, toxic masculinity and patriarchy. It's all bad. Blah, 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 blah. But even here, he makes a point of pointing out that he was an example of fatherly authority in the home. That would indicate that there were homes that were not, having a fatherly authority, or an example of a good one, certainly. And it's interesting that he doesn't even qualify it as good. An example of fatherly authority in the home. It's kind of an admission that fatherly authority is good in the home. And when there's not fatherly authority, when there's more chaos, or maybe the wife or the motherly authority is ruling the home, that it's not so good. And I think in some ways you see that reflected in our current society, that there just seems to be a lot of chaos, a lot of yelling, screaming, and a lot of just rampant more for me, more for me. And that doesn't seem to have any good end, because it hasn't been good, and it's especially ramped up in the last few years. It's 2017 as of the time of this recording. And so I do wonder if perhaps we could learn a little bit from Marcus Aurelius about that. What it means to live as nature requires. Okay. gravity without airs, to show intuitive sympathy for friends, tolerance to amateurs and sloppy thinkers. That's interesting. Tolerance to amateurs. We have to understand that the first time someone's doing something, it's not going to be good. People are extremely tolerant of children when they're learning to walk, when they're learning to speak, when they're learning to say, when you give a young child a gift and they don't say thank you, most of the time the parents will remind them to do it. But you don't get angry at the child. They're just learning to human. They don't remember to say thank you all the time. But maybe we should show a bit of that same sort of tolerance, even when we're older and we're doing things for the first time. Because, for example, I've just started using Photoshop within the last year. And that is an amazingly complex program that you could do anything with a photo, with a picture in it. Just absolutely anything, given enough time and knowledge and research, that you could do anything. And if, say for example, if I were to show people those works, would it be fair, knowing that it was the first year, the first time I've used Photoshop, no formal training, and to criticize that at the same level as you would someone who's been a professional photographer for 25 years? Well, when I put it that way, it does sound kind of silly. So perhaps in our personal lives, we can always make sure to show tolerance when someone's trying something new, even an adult. Sloppy thinkers. Yes, because anytime you venture into some new area, it's going to be kind of sloppy because you don't even know what's already been thought about in the area. And I dare say that most of us don't probably have the time to even read all of the big textbooks or even all the big books in a certain area. So we're going to make mistakes. Now, hopefully with dialogue and with writing and reflection, we can improve that for ourselves, not even necessarily for public consumption or something like that. Not that we're all going to try to speak in front of a group and sway them one way or the other, but that we can have a little bit of sloppy thinking to get it cleaned up in an area that we're not familiar with. Because I'd hate to think that we are only allowed to stick in the areas that we received a formal education in college. Actually, I would say that's stupid. That's absolutely stupid. How many of us have an education in nutrition? But we all eat. So are we all expected to go get a degree in nutrition before we eat anything? And even then, I would argue, I don't think those degrees in nutrition are very good. I think you probably need a lot more information than is currently being given. Look at the food pyramid that they used to have for so many years, given by the government. Those were the officials and the authorities, and they knew they had all the degrees and all the information. That food guide pyramid makes you fat. There's way too many bread and carbs in there. Way too many. And they've changed it now. So what do we say now? Silence. Until someone can give me a coherent reason, of why the authorities get to dictate to us what we should be doing I see no reason why. I see just as sloppy methodology and thinking in experts as I do in normal people. So I will have to listen to what they're actually saying to determine if it applies to me and if it's relevant and what I think about it. I see no other way around this. We cannot just take experts at their word. Look what they told us about eggs. Eggs are bad for you, too much cholesterol, don't eat them. Now they're like, oh, eggs are good for you. You can eat them. Butter's bad, eat margarine. Oh, it's the last couple of years. Butter? Oh, it's good for you. Margarine? It's really bad for you, actually. You don't need to be eating margarine. And, there were people saying that at the time. Nobody listened to them. They listened to the experts, from the U.S. government. Because indeed, I do remember seeing a study where they showed that with the government's increased campaign against cholesterol, that Americans did actually listen and ate less and less butter, and they ate more and more margarine. So, there are some, not everybody, obviously, but there was, a significant number of people that did listen and follow that advice, and it was wrong. I just don't see any other way to get around having to think for yourself, unfortunately. It would be nice if we can consult the panel of experts and they would give us the true information that was perfect. But I have yet to really see that in practice in any way. And if somebody has an example, I'd be open to it, although I would say that one or two exceptions do not make the rule by any means. But there must be at least some panels that were, some group of experts that were pretty good and came out with good information somewhere along the way. They probably ignored them, though. His ability to get along with everyone, sharing his company, was the highest of compliments and the opportunity and honor for those around him. To investigate and analyze with understanding and logic the principles we ought to live by. Okay, there's that logos, logic idea coming back. Not to display anger or other emotions, to be free of passion and yet full of love. I think in this sense that when they're saying passion, they really mean like that anger and frustration. And, when you want to just be like an animal inside, so to speak. Because he does give the idea of love. And if I remember correctly, I'm not an expert. I don't really know anything about the Greek language. But one thing I do remember about it is that it's a very precise language. And that they have, that's why they have 4 or 5 different words for love. Because they were very precise in what kind of love are you talking about. Eros is the most common one, the lustful love that we're familiar with. But there was also the love of family, the love of community. And they had a specific word for those. So I'm guessing that that's again, to be free of passion and yet full of love. To praise without bombast. To display expertise without pretension. All good. All good advice. And I think I'm going to stop there with Sextus. And if you listen to this, I appreciate it. And I hope that you either learn something from it or I'm going to learn something from it when you add a comment down below. Thank you.